Hi, everyone. Is this mic on? You can hear me in the back? Great. Welcome. My name is Suzanne Preston Blier, and it is truly my honor to have been invited to introduce Mike Gomez. I'm following in the suite of at the tail end of a triad of really brilliant introductors and the last of two really absolutely remarkable lectures. And so it is truly an honor. And I thought I would begin by saying something sort of a little bit more personal, along with the lines of my own engagement with Professor Gomez. I'm working on my own on a project involving medieval Africa, and I read his 2018 book, African Dominion, A New History of Empire in Early and Medieval West Africa, and I was floored by it. And sometimes the best and the worst way to read a book is when you really know the material quite well, or you think you do, and you know where the fault lines are, and you know where the critical issues are, and you know you can be really critical, and I really was blown out of the water. And it was the small things, but the big things like positioning Gao before Ghana. I went, whoa, that really changes the world. And it was the small things, but the important things like challenging the issues of descendants of Mansa Mūsā himself and those questions. And it was a series of other things that just really impressed and stunned me. And I was, on the one hand, thrilled about it, and on the other hand, I really didn't like it, because if you're working on a subject, the last thing in the world you want is somebody to write the really great book, and then you're stuck with doing whatever you want to do. But in any event, I decided, and I've been doing this more, to email him to say, this is really a terrific book, and I've got a couple of other questions. And as you probably know, half the time nobody ever responds, but he did. And so we began a conversation on email on a series of questions. I had one about the capital of Mali and how he moved right up to the edge of what I was going to make it an argument, and why did he not go that extra step, and what were the counter forms of evidence, and so it was that, to me, I think, is the most important kind of thing that we can do as scholars, is to answer emails and to engage in conversations, about critical issues and thinking forward. This is not really a kind of situation where there's only one way to envision the world, and I think more than anything else that I've gotten from these lectures so far is the primacy, indeed the importance, for us to really reconsider historic Africa and take it in full stride. And we will be wrong on key things, but in a certain sense, it doesn't matter. I think the point is that the whole issue of a lost history for Africa is not only pejorative, but pretty insane, because we're chopping off our arms to some of the most important material in African history, and certainly in global history. Let me go from that personal note to a more professional note. Michael Gomez is the Silver Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. I think it should be renamed the Gold Professor, but for the moment it will stand as another mineral. He earned his PhD at the University of Chicago, which, as anybody here knows, is an absolutely critical center for not only critical thinking and Middle East studies, but a whole array of really challenging perspectives on the world. He's written a number of incredibly important works, from Pragmatism in the Age of Jihad to Reversing Sale, A History of African Diaspora, some 15 or 20 really well-placed, well-argued articles, and a number of other really important engagements, founding a kind of center engagement to really focus on diaspora history in new and important ways, and crossing, much like ships, the pathways between Africa and other worlds, whether in America or in Europe. So it gives me great pleasure and join me in thanking Mike Gomez. Tonight's title is Hidden in Plain Sight, Gender and Power and Privilege in Imperial Space. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bois, for your very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here again with you for the third and final leg of these lectures. I once again want to thank Professor Gates for the gracious invitation. I'm delighted to see Professor Higginbotham. I think I saw Professor Champong come in, or maybe I did not. But it's a pleasure to see old friends again, and I think I may have made a few new ones since being here, and I've just had a wonderful time. I apologize to those of you who've had to sit through these lectures, and this is the third one, but you know, I'm doing what I can, so I'm delighted to be here. An exploration of early and medieval West African history, attendant to questions of women and gender, necessarily works against the grain of a phallocentric evidentiary base. But it can also work within that grain to form a startling, altogether unexpected record within which women, though not necessarily featuring, nonetheless emerge as principals in their own right. The result is a mosaic of varying elements and quality consisting of both written and oral documentation formed over centuries that in mutual conversation reveals the trajectory of formal political power that is gradually masculinized at the considerable expense of women, but within which women, whose voices are rarely heard directly and whose images only take form in relation to those of men, manage to rise from the most humble of circumstances to wield, if not formal power, such formidable influence as to make and break heads of state. Likewise, in the parallel universe of religious practice and erudition, their spiritual analogs were often the human agencies through whom moved a superhuman force. Our discussion begins in Imperial Songhai during the 16th century, when Timbuktu and Guinea enjoyed reputations as premier centers of learning, with the former boasting between 150 and 180 Quranic schools, attended by as many as 9,000 students. The Islamic sciences were studied there, centering on the Quran and its exegesis or tafsir, followed in importance by the study of hadith or traditions of the Prophet, but also jurisprudence or fiqh, Arabic grammar, nahwa, syntax, rhetoric, logic, as well as medicine and astronomy, critical for lunar-based cultures engaged in extensive cross-regional travel. As important, however, was the fact that these cities were also locations of concentrated, communicable spiritual power, or baraka, carried, if not embodied, in the persons of those who led exemplary lives of erudition and piety. And here I have just a slide of some manuscripts. And for those of you who've been to Timbuktu or Guinea or Gao, Mopti, etc., this landscape is filled with such material. And it's lamentable that the events took place in 2012 and 13, because it will take a considerable army of scholars to work through this material. And there's a lot of work that remains. So this is just a smidget of the kinds of manuscripts in this area. And this is one folio of Tariq el-Fatash. We've been talking about Tariq el-Fatash quite a bit. In such a context, knowledge was a process of transmission involving not simply intellectual endeavor, but also observation and imitation of habits and lifestyle, underscoring the critical nature of teacher-student relationships. These were bonds, with the transfer of knowledge over generations forming isnads, or asanid, or silsilas, chains of transmission. These isnads could span centuries, and the more illustrious the individuals in the chain, the more prestigious the isnad. A cursory review of the documentation for Imperial Songhai seems to offer little insight into the ways in which women contributed to the scholarship and esoteric practice of these cities. Upon closer examination, however, one of the striking features of the various nodes of saints and scholars are sort of unofficial back-channel silsilas, or isnads, or lines of transmission, often composed of women, usually unnamed, through whom exceptional individuals and generations were vitally connected. If only descent through the paternal line is considered, recognition of ancestors responsible for the rise of many of Timbuktu's elites would be impossible, their heritage eviscerated. This is particularly true of the Akis, Timbuktu's leading clerical family, who often supplied the city with its qadis, imams, leading sheikhs, and other religious officials. One of the most famous was the Sheikh al-Islam Qadi Mahmud ibn Omar ibn Muhammad Aki, who died in 1548. Although Ahmed Baba describes Qadi Mahmud's father, Omar, as a learned and righteous jurist, he was in fact far from accomplished. In turn, Omar's father, that is Qadi Mahmud's grandfather, Muhammad Aki, was wholly unrefined and unrelated to scholarship. Such combined lackluster contributes to an emphasis in the chronicles on the Anda Ag Muhammad ancestry of the subsequent Akis, that is, their maternal line. Here is, I thought this would be interesting. This is a rendition of René Caillet's visit to Timbuktu in 1828. And it's a little difficult to figure out exactly what's happening. This, I believe, this represents Gingery Bear Mosque. This was the international mosque. That is to say, this is where Friday prayer took place. And if you study the line of imams of the mosques, most of them came from outside of the region. I believe that this represents Sankore. And we see a similar kind of representation by Heinrich Barth, who's in the city in 1858. And so this is another perspective. I'm not quite sure in which direction the artist is facing, but I think this is a rendition of Sankore Mosque. And it's if anything, it's an ideational representation of the stature and importance of the mosque. So that's 1858. This is a contemporary picture of Gingery Bear Mosque. And once again, this is where Friday prayer takes place for the city. And this is a picture of Sankore. Okay. The importance of the maternal line continues through Qadi Mahmud, as his barakah flowed not only through sons, but through daughters as well. So that Abu Labas, Muhammad ibn Sa'id, otherwise known as Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Said, and Mahmud's grandson, through a daughter. He's known as Mahmud's grandson, Qadi Mahmud's grandson, through a daughter, was considered a righteous friend of God, someone who would be called a wali, as well as a divine. He had a direct relationship with his grandfather, Qadi Mahmud, and studied with him the Risala of Abi Zaid, the Muqtasar of Khalil, etc., etc. Mahmud Khati and Ahmed Baba would also join his teaching circle, as would his own uncle, Qadi Omar ibn Faqih Mahmud. Yet another of Qadi Mahmud's grandsons, through a daughter, Abu Bakr ibn Ahmed Behr, was so righteous that his paternal uncles agreed he should become the leader of worship. I have another representation for you, just a sense of the kind of treasure that was located in Timbuktu. This is a page of the Quran that was originally bought in the 13th century in Fez and was housed in the Ahmed Baba Center in Timbuktu, but was removed for safety with the occupation in 2012. A wonderful illustration of how the barakah of Anda Ag Muhammad the Elder continued to extend to descendants through their mothers is the case of Imam Anda Ag Muhammad, who became Imam of Timbuktu's Sankore Mosque. Best known as a eulogist of the Prophet, the divinely favored Anda Ag Muhammad had 5 divinely favored daughters, who in turn gave birth to divinely favored sons. 5 of these sons would achieve considerable renown, with the chronicler of Tariq Sudan, Asadi, making absolutely clear that though known as the sons of this or that man, they inherited their barakah through their mothers. Other than serving as vessels through whom illustrious sons were born, mothers were also important to their formation as scholars and saints. Asadi, the author of Tariq Sudan, may evince greater sensitivity to and awareness of the role of women in this capacity, as he frequently acknowledges that he's descended from Abdullah el-Balbali through his Fulani wife. And it is Asadi who reports on a compact between Qasay, the mother of Skilaj Muhammad, and Nana Tinti, the daughter of Abu Bakr ibn al-Qadi al-Hajj. It is believed that the prayers of Nana Tinti were critical to the downfall of Sunni Ali, ruler of Songhai from 1464 to 1492 and persecutor of the Aki family. Though her efficacious prayers may be attributed to the barakah of her father, it is nonetheless channeled through Nana Tinti, and as such is an example of how the sources implicitly embed the spiritual qualities of women. Asadi also records the death of the Sharifa Nana Behr and her daughter, the Sharifa Nana Aisha, 7 days later in 1611. These are the reference to women in this capacity, in this context, is very, very rare in the Tariqs. And so this suggests that as descendants of the Prophet, that is, they were Sharifian, they enjoyed a high level of prestige. Though scarce, such evidence, when combined with consideration of mothers as sources of barakah, suggests they were even more Songhai women who were spiritual leaders in their own right. Transitioning from spiritual to overtly political roles played by women transports the analysis back to the late 12th and early 13th centuries and the dawn of Imperial Mali, when and where we reconsider traditions concerning the birth of Sunjata, who founds the empire around 1230. The relationship of women to polity is a central theme in these traditions, with dimensions both plausible as well as representative of Mande social and political milieu. To begin, there is tumult in Sangara, either adjacent to or confined with the land of Du. And this would be in the heartland, in this area here. In the land of, so Sangara and the land of Du are essentially the same place. And this is where a buffalo, or koba, in some traditions referred to as a horse antelope, has ravaged the land, killing farmers, terrorizing its 12 villages. The buffalo is in fact Du Camisa, a woman who, undergoing transmogrification, has not ceased in her campaign to kill 12 people each night in each of the 12 villages. In desperation, hunters from surrounding lands are recruited, but they are also killed by the koba, with conditions continuing to deteriorate until the arrival of two Traoré brothers who, speaking with an old woman in Dur, learn that she is in fact the koba. The reasons she provides for the rampage are instructive. As in one account, she explains, quote, "Because my 12 brethren always treated me so vilely. My brethren have all the good things, villages, slaves, riches, but they gave me not one single slave to bring me water or wood for my hearth." Another account equally identifies gender asymmetries as the generative source of difficulties, with the sister excluded from sacrificial rites and observances of her younger brother, the ruler Domago, simply because she is a woman. Beyond material advantage, the grievance is more concerned with political prerogative, as each brother rules over a village. Sangara or Do may therefore represent a place and time when the relationship between political power and gender, once fluid, was undergoing a process of masculinization. Unacceptable to Do Camisa, her protest was lethal. In laying waste to the realm by way of the mystical and magical, women shift to the supernatural as a compensatory strategy. Mandate traditions in other areas where Islam would gradually become significant also include discussions of women who assumed the Mansaya, or rulership, with accounts from the Gambia region asserting that the very first Mansa of Niumi was a woman, Mansa Mama Adami Jame, who was succeeded by another woman, Mansa Wami. Niumi, in fact, boasts 12 women who consecutively held the Mansaya, while states all along the Gambia claimed female rulers from Badibu to Wuli. Perhaps this was characteristic of Mande society, at least astride the Gambia before Islam. Dukamisa instructs the Traoré brothers on how to kill the buffalo. But in her self-sacrifice, she also mandates that they request Sogolan, the 10th daughter of the ruler, as their reward. As it turns out, Sogolan, regarded in the sources as an extremely unattractive woman, is the double of Du Camisa. So although the buffalo is destroyed, Du Camisa lives on through Sogolan. The Traoré brothers will bring Sogolan to Magan Konfata, ruler of an incipient Mali, and they become the parents of Sunjata. Whether all actually unfolded as described is less important than the observation that Sunjata is directly linked to an embittered Do Camisa, her suffering displayed in Sogolan's tortured features. Du Camisa therefore exacts her revenge, living through Sogolan to usher into the world a person of unprecedented power and grandeur, Sunjata. The Du Camisa cum Sogolan saga therefore serves dual, seemingly contradictory purposes. It affirms the righteous indignation of women over the loss of political power, yet celebrates the political sphere as the preserve of men. since Sunjata, after all, was a man. As such, the story of Sunjata's origins is a mechanism of assuagement and legitimization, a double move, responding to women's resentment through their resituation as sorcerers and reification as mothers. They become alternative sites of puissance, channeling unseen and dangerous forces. The account is therefore a strategy of reconciliation, with Sunjata and Kumisa vitally connected, sharing the same victory. Sunjata was said to have been a large, heavy infant who crushed midwives and who grew into a large bull, his huge head and large eyes connecting him to the Koba. Dukamisa of Sangara, in contrast to Dukamisa and her double Sogalan, Magan Konfata is consistently described as an extremely handsome man, making the point that Sunjata, though Magan Konfata's son, is even more the son of Sogalan. He receives, that is to say, Sunjata receives the Islamically influenced Baraka from his father, but he inherits the Nyama, or life force, and true Mande core from his mother. In some traditions, Sogalan is said to also have Dalilu, or powers of sorcery, and it is from such mothers that male heroes receive their powers. As such, Sunjata becomes the vessel within which Baraka, Nyama, and Dalilu, and by inference, Islam and ancestral beliefs, are all reconciled. Until her demise, Sunjata and Sogalan remained very close in all of the traditions, as is the case with his sister, Kolokun. Their tight bonds reflect the degree to which Sunjata is the product of women, and not just in the biological sense, since in the ideational realm, their spiritual abilities prove indispensable to Sunjata's survival and rise. This view is part of a broad social and cultural setting, demonstrating Mande society's high regard for women as both mothers as well as conduits of an incorporeal dimension, engendering spheres of power, political and spiritual, that plausibly reflect historical processes. There's yet another element to consider here, and it is the martial quality of a new imperial tradition, introducing Mali's founder as not only hunter but warrior, in association with heightened levels of violence. This is no mere trope or archetypical element, readily identifiable in 1,000 other stories, as independent primary sources in fact record a period of significant raiding and conflict, led by Sunjata's nemesis, the Susu leader Sumanguru Sumaru, against whom Sunjata waged war and established an independent Maninka state. The fighting corresponds to elevated activity in trans-Saharan trafficking and was surely a response that both supplied and resisted slaving. Accounts of these leaders, therefore, initiate a novel tradition, at least within this region, of ruler as military conqueror, with an expectation of territorial expansion now part of the monarchical portfolio. That is to say, if I can step back a minute, there's really no tradition of Ghana or Ouagadougou or Kayamaga, this is the same polity, as having an imperial tradition. This begins with Sunjata. As such, or for that matter, any of the city-states that dot the Sahel from the coast, from the Atlantic coast all the way to Lake Chad. As such, Sumanguru and Sunjata represent a rupture in what had been a more tolerant and spatially respectful royal purview. The male monopoly of Malian political authority would be directly challenged 100 years later during the reign of Mansa Suleiman in Songhai. We know this because Ibn Battuta just happened to be visiting the realm at the time in 1352, when and where he witnessed a remarkable conspiracy led by Kassa, Suleiman's chief wife and first cousin, the daughter of a maternal uncle. The Mansa had become displeased
and imprisoned her, replacing her with Bandu, a woman of non-royal heritage. In the ceremony recognizing her elevation, Suleiman's female first cousins signaled their rejection of Bandu as chief wife. And when Bandu complained, the female cousins were required to do penitence by appearing naked before the Mansa for 7 days after having initially sought asylum in the mosque. When eventually freed, Kassa was not restored as chief wife, and her response was to undertake the decidedly political performance of daily riding through town, enslaved men and women in tow, at the conclusion of which she would stand veiled at the gates of the mashwar, or the council place. As this became a much discussed scandal, one of her slave girls was summoned before the Mansa and the Grand Council, where the girl confessed she had served as Kassa's envoy to the Mansa's paternal first cousin Jatil, who had previously taken refuge from the Mansa for an unspecified offense. Through the slave girl, Kassa had allegedly encouraged Jatil to, quote, depose the Sultan from his kingship, saying, "I and all the army are at your service." Upon learning this, the royal counselors exclaimed that Kassa had committed, quote, a great crime, and for it she deserved to be killed. Kassa would seek sanctuary with the khatib, the person who delivers the Friday prayer or Friday sermon, and nothing more is recorded of this affair. Such an open display of defiance is extraordinary, involving both branches of the Keita royal family. As a paternal first cousin, Jatil may have been a direct descendant of Sunjata, as opposed to Suleiman and Mūsā, Mansa Mūsā, who descend from the line of Sunjata's brother, Mandan Bukhari or Mandan Bori. Very interesting name. He may have also been the brother of the female first cousins who could not abide Bandu's selection. Jatil could have been on the run because he was a strong pretender, with Kassa's overture and effort to exploit a rivalry. Her standing at the gates of the council place suggests some counselors may have sided with her, especially her claim that the army would back them. And though her pledge to deliver the entire military may have been hyperbole, it reveals she understood the elements of a successful revolt. Now remember, Ibn Battuta is recording all of this. This has all the marks of a serious push for power and could explain her initial imprisonment, the specifics of which Ibn Battuta could only have been vaguely aware. As the daughter of a maternal uncle, and therefore most likely the brother of Mūsā's mother, Kankan, Kassa's demotion and imprisonment may have also reopened wounds, and I talked about this during the first lecture. Imperial Songhai inherited the Malian practice of exclusive male political authority at the highest levels. Though an important development takes place, that recenters the unlikeliest of women as political actors. To begin, while royal women in Songhai were recognized, it is not clear if their status translated into formal positions of authority. At the very least, a designation of respect, the title Waisa precedes the names of several daughters of Ascilaj Muhammad: Waisa Bani, Waisa Aisha Kara, Waisa Hafsa, Waisa Hani. Beyond these women, others without titles are also mentioned. And like the women associated with religious elites in Timbuktu, these women derive status as the daughters of the Askia or as mothers of leading officials. Waisa Hani is similarly identified as a mother, but otherwise the first three women bearing the title Waisa are not associated with children. This title reappears for two daughters of Askia Dawood, again without relation to marriage or motherhood, Waisa Hafsa and Waisa Kaibunu. That it carried some political connotation is further suggested by Asadi's mention of Waisa Hafsa's death in 1560, stating that in that year, In the following year, Waisa Kabunu assumed office, this is his quote, only to pass away in 1565. The Waisa women are the only ones mentioned in Tariq Sudan in conjunction with an office, but it must have been a significant post, as their deaths are mentioned in conjunction with other prominent figures. Otherwise, several of Askia Dawood's daughters are noted for their position as wives of prominent men, including religious figures. Speaking specifically of Dawood's daughters, Asadi writes, many of them were married to scholars, jurists, merchants, and army commanders. Initially examined regarding the Kumisa and Sunjata, the apparent rerouting of female power in West Africa from the political to the nominal is supported by what little evidence exists for Songhai female office holders. However, on Songhai's southeastern border, and this would be the area that I'm talking about here, this is Hausaland, were women serving not only as officials, but also as sovereigns, with Hausa women rulers long attracting attention, in particular the 16th century figure of Amina or Aminatu of Zaria. She can be located within a broader territorial spectrum of women rulers, from the very famous to those with less legible power. Otherwise, the literature tends to emphasize women controlling certain spheres of endeavor or in exercising power by virtue of their position relative to the male ruler, such as queen mothers, or influencing such processes as succession or becoming prominent within periods of liminality, such as regency. In addition to those few instances in which women wielded formal power, were those in which their authority was not initially political, but subsequently underwent translation by which they became decidedly political. Examples of both can be found along Songhai's western frontier in this area. This is the area that I'm going to talk about here. Examples of both can be found along Songhai's western frontier, where the sources provide two examples of female rulers during the time of Sunni Ali. The first is said to have conquered the land of the Sanhaja Nono, a group living in Masina, under the leadership of one Queen Bikun Kabi. The other example is a fascinating account of resilience as well as resurgence, centering on one Yanu of Anganda village, presumably east of Lake Debu. Lake Debu is in this area here. This is a closer rendering of this area. This is a very important area to the southwest of Timbuktu. And so here is Lake Debu. The Masina area is here. And so this is the area of interest with the Banjargara Massif in this area. This is a very mountainous area here. So this Yanu of Anganda village would establish a community in this mountainous Hajar between Homburi and Danaka. The origins of her authority are unspecified, but it was manifestly political by the time Songhai assaulted the area in 1588, putting Yanu to flight while capturing her niece Jata. Yanu then traveled to Budara, perhaps east of Bara province. It's all in the same area, where she emerges as a great ruler, according to the sources, evidently possessed of considerable leadership skills. Yanu's political and military prowess were on full display when the Barakoi Mansa Mūsā, this is a different Mansa Mūsā, leader of the Bara province, asked for her aid in putting down a revolt by one Mindijam, an iron worker. At the head of some 50 cavalry, Yanu led the charge, defeating and killing Mindijam, after which she established the town of Buyu on choice land in Bara province, which was the condition of her assistance. Yanu died with no heir save a nephew named Mūsā. So the people of Buyu went to Jata and returned to Buyu with Mūsā, where he became Banakoi, the first to bear that title. Koi simply means ruler. Though male leaders round out the story, Yanu's leadership and bravery in these circumstances constitute its compelling core. Consistent with what little is known about the Waisas under Skilaj Muhammad and Dawood, Yanu is not associated with marriage, with the text specifically stating she left no heirs, a seeming signal that marriage and maternity were viewed as antithetical to political power, that women could only hold office outside of such disqualifying statuses. That female political authorities are rarely mentioned in the chronicle further points to a prevailing male-centered notion of authority connected with war and plunder. That Yanu reemerges as a political leader, steed-mounted and handling a sword as skillfully as a man, does not disrupt so much as strengthen the view that Yanu was becoming an exception to what were otherwise masculinist performances. While female political leaders seem to have been rare in Songhai, giving birth to children within elite formations. Let me start that again. While female political leaders seem to have been rare in Songhai, giving birth to children within elite formations was a far more predictable route to recognition, prestige, and even power. The mothers of sons who rose to prominence as scholars, saints, or as political figures have been mentioned, but there is another category of mothers whose rise to notoriety is altogether counterintuitive, yet critical to understanding not only the experiences of women and concepts of gender, but also theories of governance as well as slavery in Imperial Songhai. This is the category of the concubine, by definition an enslaved female. Eskil Muhammad would reconfigure the position into one of the most powerful in the realm. Confirming the political influence of those living within the Askia's circle of intimacy, ASWAD, the author of Sudan, names the mothers of the successors to Eskil Muhammad as well as some of his other sons, beginning with Askia Mūsā's mother, Zara Kabirun Koi, originally a slave girl, a slave to a ruler of Kabirun, followed by Mariam Dabu, so-called Wangara mother, that is to say she was Soninke. She would become the mother of Askia Ismail. Then Kulthum Barda of Dirma, who was possibly Tuareg, and the mother of Askia Ishaq Bear. Then Sana ibn Fari Koi, Askia Dawood's mother, and so on. So ASWAD lists 11 women altogether within this context. Other than Zara Kabirun Koi, the statuses of these women are not provided, but they were in fact all concubines, as Tariq el-Fattash maintains that save for Eskil Muhammad himself, all of the Askias were the sons of concubines. The implications for concubinage's high profile in the royal court are no less than stunning. To begin, a valid assumption is that Eskil Muhammad was married, presumably to no more than 4 wives at one time. The Askia or any other free slaveholder could marry a concubine upon first manumitting her. But the fact that none of his wives are named in the sources, nor any of their children explicitly identified in any of these sources, is astounding. Second, Eskil Muhammad must have been around 52 years of age when he became Askia in 1493, as he was 97 when he died in 1538. He therefore probably fathered children long before becoming Askia, and would end up with many children, apparently in the hundreds. Though the order of succession was loosely based on age and lineal proximity, there was a degree of flexibility and absence of precision inherited from the Malian model. Under normal circumstances, this allowed for the succession's contestation without necessarily endangering the realm. But in times of crisis, as the Moroccan invasion constituted like no other, it contributed to the forces of destabilization. As Dawood would follow his father's example in producing numerous progeny, it is not possible that given so many potential pretenders for the throne, as well as other plum assignments, the mothers of these children did not play a vital role in promoting the interests of their children against those of others. Rivalries were therefore intense, the royal court heavy with intrigue. no outcome was guaranteed, opening the door to such machinations that the sons of the Ascia's wives lost out every time. Rivalry between children of free and enslaved women within complex, large harems was hardly unique to Songhai. The anthropological record for the Songhai Zarma of the region suggests enmity between the sons of concubines and wives became an anticipated social feature. Informed by a dichotomous framing within which children of the same mother, the Nia Isi, experienced affectionate bonds, in contrast to the sons of the same father, the Bab Isi, who viewed each other adversarially. The children of concubines, the Wahai Isi, would come to suffer stigmatization, although they could aspire to high office. But this is nowhere in evidence in the 16th century. Referred to in the Quran as that which your right hands possess, ma malaka aymainukum. A concubine's status changed to that of an walad, a mother of a child, once she bore a child for a free man, and paternity was acknowledged, after which she could not be sold for as long as that man lived and was freed upon death. Her children, however, were born free, inheriting the status and identity of their father. This was apparently the case for hundreds of children and their mothers under the Ascias. That all of Askia Elijah Muhammad's successors were the sons of concubines is no greater testimony of adherence to these principles. Though status and inheritance flow through the paternal line, it is fascinating that the identities of these enslaved women, of these enslaved mothers, were not erased, but in fact preserved, as opposed to the names of royal wives. Though matrilineal may have been unofficially and discreetly recognized among the Songhai, royal concubines of the imperial era were more than acknowledged. They were celebrated, in part a reflection of their giving birth to rulers. Thus, Zara Kabirun Koi is conspicuous in her mention. She was sought out by several regional rulers and had children by at least 3 of them. Her son Mūsā is in fact regarded as Askia el-Hajj Muhammad's first son. Instructive given the high probability that Muhammad already had adult children, even before becoming Askia. Like Zara Kabirun Koi, Fatima Zugrani, the mother of Askia Ishaq, left such an imprint that her son was known as Askia Ishaq Zugrani, or Askia Ishaq the Zugrani. No doubt a curious, if not conflictual, experience for him, as the Zugrani were the clients of the Middle Niger Fulbe, where they were called the Jawambi, with the name, therefore, a reminder of servile heritage. These examples demonstrate that women subjugated in this way could nonetheless reinvent themselves and influence the direction of empire itself. In addition to the mothers of future rulers were other royal concubines, such as Tati, the Zainki, perhaps a Jahanke woman. She was the mother of the Benga farmer Ali Bindi. And then you had Amina Kirao. She was referred to as the Ajur woman of mixed ancestry from the people of Kisu. You had Amina Way Barada, Amisi Kara, Kamsa Miman Koi. This term Miman is apparently a reference to the province of Mimma. Their variegated appellations, beyond simply indicating a diversity targeted by the Songhai military, allude to something more profound in Askia Elijah Muhammad's theory of governance. Beyond birthing and nurturing royals, concubines occasionally feature in the sources and in ways that suggest their influence was significant indeed. Kamsa Mimam Koi, the mother of Kanfari Uthman, an office second only to that of the Askia, was one such woman. The immediate context was bloody internecine conflict under Askia Mūsā, who in 1531 had just deposed his father, an aging, blind Askia Elijah Muhammad. Though only in office for 2 years, he visited such destruction that the author of Tariq as-Sudan Saadi blames him for unleashing what he calls a fitna, a time of great trouble and instability in Songhai. Like some imitation of Absalom's going into his father King David's concubines, Mūsā not only put his father out of the royal palace, but kept his wives and concubines for himself. In response, the deposed Muhammad could only pray, "O God, uncover Mūsā's genitals and shame him." According to the traditions, answered the next day when Mūsā fell from his horse, his private parts exposed before his entire army. Tariq el-Fattash pulls no punches, saying that of all who would claim the Asciyate, no one was more despicable or insignificant than Mūsā, that the office of Asqiya was far too lofty for someone of his impudence. Another translation of the term is stupidity. The threat was such that several surviving sons, the threat from this Asqiya Mūsā, who deposes his father, Asqiyaj Muhammad, the threat was such that several surviving sons of Asqiyaj Muhammad fled the capital of Gao, seeking asylum with their brother, the Kanfari Uthman, governor of the western half of the empire and seated in the town of Tindurma. We've talked about Tindurma before. Tindurma is in this area here. It's to the south of Timbuktu. You can see it on this close-up in this map here. Here is Tindurma. Very, very important town. Yet another brother, the powerful Binga Farma Bala, would later join them, constituting a Tindurma-based rebellion in formation against Gao. And Gao is in the eastern buckle here. Okay, so it's on the other side of the realm. Yet another brother, the powerful Binga, oh yes, I just read that. Asqiya Mūsā's response is most instructive. Seeking a diplomatic solution, he sends a letter to Kanfari Uthman, but he sends a second letter to his mother, Kamsa Mimun Khoi, in the event the Kanfari proved obstinate. In fact, the Kanfari refused to even acknowledge the royal envoy. But in his letter to Kamsa, the Asqiya requested, this is interesting, he requested her intervention in order to avoid bloodshed. And he also placed himself under her herma, or protection, which is very unusual, out of recognition of her influence and strategic position. Indeed, she may have been the only person in the entire realm capable of averting war. Kamsa, quote, read the letter and understood its contents, unquote. So she was literate, though a concubine. Perhaps she had learned Arabic in Quranic school, developing a reputation as a woman of piety and wisdom. She would only partially succeed in temporarily persuading her son to initially reconsider conflict with Mūsā, as in the end, the Kanfari opted for war. Kamsa Mimun Khoi was therefore a person of gravitas, but her individual experience, along with that of other relatively privileged concubines, was of little consequence for the many more women and girls who had been uprooted from their homes and families and subsequently objectified, assaulted, and violated. No matter its size, the royal harem could not account for the untold numbers of women trafficked into this condition and unable to significantly alter their trajectories. There were concubines and there were concubines, with those bearing sons for rulers, clerics, and merchants occupying a very different space, figuratively and literally. Further underscoring the rule was the exceptional female captive who underwent a rather dramatic transformation in her circumstance, as in the case of Asadi's ancestor, Imam Abdullah al-Balbali, who married the Fulani captive, Aisha, who was Asadi's mother. In like spirit, Uryan al-Rais would purchase many slaves and manumit them for the sake of God Most High in the hereafter, exhibiting the principle that manumission, though not obligatory, was a laudable fact. But al-Balbali and Uryan al-Rais were probably exceptional. Whereas Tariq as-Sudan asserts, Sunni Ali, this is Sunni Ali, sent many captive Fulbe as gifts to the eminent men of Timbuktu and to some of the scholars and holy men, ordering them to take them as concubines. Consistent with gifting, quote unquote, a leading female captive to the village of Mori Kora, and giving Jata, the niece of Yanu, to another Mori cleric. Asqiya Muhammad likewise awarded 2 Mori brothers and other siblings 10 slaves each, some of whom may have been concubines. The latter were certainly among the gifts, quote unquote, rulers regularly sent to the ulama of Timbuktu, the scholars of Timbuktu, including Qadi Mahmud. In support of his acclamatory introduction of Askia Muhammad as the Sultan of the Muslims, Tariq el-Fattash is explicit on this point, stating that the Askia, quote, demonstrated his love for the scholars and saints and students with many alms and deeds, both prescribed and supererogatory, as he was a person most discerning and shrewd, showing humility toward the scholars, showering them with slaves and wealth to promote the interests of the Muslims and to aid them in their obedience and service to God. Seizing women and girls from communities throughout the western Savannah and Sahel was certainly a function of imposition, but their subsequent treatment by the Askia was no unintended consequence. Rather, the elevation of royal concubines reveals itself as a well-considered policy of the state. I want you to follow me. The reasons for which are several and compelling. First, although Sunni Ali and Askia el-Hajj Muhammad were similar in capturing and enslaving women and girls, the latter's subsequent policy of inclusion was altogether distinguishing. Second, the reification of concubines who bore children for the Askia had the effect of encouraging their communities of origins to identify with Songhai and the new Askia regime, as they were now represented at the highest levels of society and government. Third, by acknowledging the children of women from such disparate backgrounds, the Askia pursued a policy of political unification through the recognition of ethnic and regional diversity, in this way becoming the father, literally and symbolically, of the Songhai Empire. Indeed, the very presence at the Palace of Concubines from multiple communities sent a dual message, one of domination as well as acceptance, that these women served as representatives of peoples who, though subject to the Songhai, were also integrally connected to the empire, the proof of which was the elevation of their sons as rulers, thus raising the status of their mothers as well. And fourth, as a Muslim sultan embracing such miscellany, Askia el-Hajj Muhammad encouraged submission to Islam throughout the realm. As such, the Askia encouraged all who participated in the cultural and political life of Songhai to think of themselves as members of the state, especially in Timbuktu and Jinni. From every indication, they fully embraced that membership and were loyal to it, an orientation that becomes more apparent with the dawn of the Moroccan occupation. And in African dominion, I try to make an argument for kind of proto citizenship in Songhai, which supersedes ethnicity, loyalty to place, and so forth. Askia el-Hajj Muhammad was therefore far wiser than his predecessor in understanding the political potential of concubinage. But even though he chose an approach more in keeping with the legal prescription than Sunni Ali, at the end of the day, he also succeeded in acquiring so many concubines that a special palace was established to house such a huge number of wives, concubines, slaves, and eunuchs assigned to watch over these women. This was a harem in the classically stereotypic Orientalist imagination, with gelded males and plenty of intrigue, entirely analogous to the Ottoman counterpart. The mention of eunuchs gestures toward their integral roles in managing the institution of concubinage, especially among the royals. There's probably little to gain in comparing their plight to that of concubines, although it might be remarked that with the latter there was some possibility of mitigation through childbirth, even freedom with the owner's death. Not so for the eunuch, whose condition was permanent and immutable. Both forms of enslavement involved violation of an egregious nature, and it was precisely the alteration of their sexuality that facilitated their access into the intimacies of elite circles. For the concubine, such admission carried the potential of future reward, however dubious. For the eunuch, certain possibilities were forever foreclosed. Al-Muhalabi mentions the presence of eunuchs in the royal court at Gao as early as the 10th century. By the time of Askia el-Hajj Muhammad in the 16th century, therefore, it would be reasonable to assume that eunuchs were recruited from the same populations as concubines, so that eunuchs and concubines from the same communities could have built upon existing cultural affinities. Given their placement in close association with females in the royal harem, eunuchs may have participated in strategies supporting the interests of children they favored. The Askia, busy with empire, religion, and impregnating women, would have had little time to actually raise so many children, and would have depended upon eunuchs, thus deepening their influence. The likelihood that Hukokuri Koi Alifulan, the functional equivalent of the Askia's wazir or chief of staff, was a eunuch, only strengthens the notion that their influence could be considerable. But eunuchs were hardly confined to the care of royal concubines. Some 700, each outfitted in silken attire, regularly stood behind the Askia Dawood during royal audiences. In fact, the use, if not dependence on eunuchs, may have grown over time, as some 4,000 comprised a eunuch cavalry, quote unquote, led by the Huku Korikoi during the final days of Songhai's independence. The inclusion of eunuchs in what was a professional standing army underscores its servile component. By the reign of Askia Muhammad Bani from 1586 to 88, the critical position of the Kabara farmer was also held by a eunuch. Under Askia al-Hajj Muhammad, royal slaves, especially concubines and eunuchs, began to assume significant power and influence, both formally and informally, emerging as veritable elites. Though they could be rivals in advocating for favorite mothers and sons, they also came together to promote their own collective interests. A conjoined consciousness and solidarity formed that in time would express itself as an organized, if loyal, constituency. The rise in the profile of royal eunuchs indicate they came to function as a virtual bureaucracy at Gao. As royals battled and eliminated one another, there was an ongoing need to keep the ship of state afloat. Eunuchs, with their intimate knowledge of the court and affairs of state, were uniquely qualified to fill the void, for which they were rewarded sumptuously. Their rise is not unlike that of the Janissaries and Mamluks, servile officers more than capable of exploiting access, and in ways resulting in the dramatic augmentation of their power. A model of slavery as qualified reciprocity, though akin to that of marginality ameliorization in its approach, better accounts for the experiences of royal slaves, especially eunuchs. The eunuch could become very intimate with the royal family, though never fully become part of it, nor was there any capacity for amelioration over successive generations. Bonds of affection certainly developed, but as opposed to familial integration, the quid pro quo for him was influence and power. The concubine and the eunuch would have the greatest potential to wield authority in Songhai society. Having suffered and survived so much loss, they had the potential to emerge as socially transformed. The violation of their person, the very mechanism by which they were now entrusted with position and responsibility. They could have paid no greater price. A consideration of women and gender in the medieval West African savannah and Sahel reveals that high political office became engendered over the centuries, infused with notions of masculinity informed by both the exigency of slaving as well as the region's Islamization. The unfolding of that process, or their processes, also witnessed, inversely proportionate to the loss of formal political authority, a growing concentration of metaphysical power that was nonetheless tethered to the state in vital yet secondary or auxiliary capacities. Islam's growth in the region did not necessarily diminish the association of women with numinal force, although in cities like Timbuktu and Guinea, male preserves of erudition and piety, women became critical conduits of a different kind of spiritual reality, baraka, as it was through the maternal line that leading clerics inherited this communicable power. In this way, their examples were not unlike that of Aisha, daughter of Abu Bakr and widow of the Prophet, upon whom so many traditions, and insights depend. In contrast to the relatively privileged lives of women in elite clerical families, concubines entered their host societies as the very dregs of society, devoid of honor. Their rise to positions of extraordinary political influence as the mothers of so many leading Songhai officials is therefore all the more startling. This is not to say that their lives were enviable, nor does this brief consideration of their experience constitute a commentary on Muslim slavery in Africa relative to the Americas or elsewhere, as these are all considerations for another day. Thank you very much. Okay. Questions? Yes.
I know because I overheard your conversation about the caliphate, remember?
Yes.
But that wasn't going to be my question today.
Okay.
Did you want to say something?
Yes, we had talked about, so Professor Higginbotham had asked at the end of the first lecture about the business of Skilaj Muhammad forming a caliphate.
Or being called the
The
Caliph of the Sudan.
Yes. And my mind immediately went to what was officially a caliphate in Hausa, the Sokoto Caliphate. And in thinking about it subsequently, I think you're referring to the moment in which Skilaj Muhammad, he's in Medina, where he meets a person who confers upon him the title Khalifa of the Western Sudan, which in that context meant that he was the kind of
Head black man.
that he was the lieutenant. And there's speculation as to who this person could have been. And my former mentor, John Hunwick, who passed away some years ago, is insistent that this was the Abbasid Caliph. Now, the Abbasids had been run out of Baghdad in 1258, but they did have a presence in the central. They retained a presence in the central Islamic land. So he may have received this title from this remnant of the Abbasids. And so he becomes he is considered their lieutenant in Western Sudan. But it carried that connotation of being a lieutenant as opposed to a caliph who was running an Islamically organized state based upon Sharia. So that's what I wanted to say to you.
It was an honorific.
It was an honorific title.
Okay, no, so here's my question now.
Yes.
It's Mali, I think, where the horses come to be bred, and they breed these horses that are both African and Barbary, and they create. And I think there's something really interesting to be said about masculinization and the horse.
Okay.
And the idea of these wonderful images. I mean, you see these images also for Nigeria, but when I read about Nigeria, the horses are not used for cavalry as much as maybe for prestige, but in Mali, they're beginning to use them for cavalry. So that idea of the marshal and the man and the horse. And when you see those images of the man on the horse, they become one. And the idea that men are breeding, there's just something about that I find very gendered.
Yeah, and that's something to really think about, and you may be very right about that. And one of the things I would say, so you've given me something more to consider, and you may well be right about that. I don't know that the sources discuss women riding horses, at least in battle. So there may be much to what you're saying. But what it does also lead to is the realization that these horses were very, very important in the Western Sudan.
Absolutely.
And typically We just don't think of West Africa in that way. But these empires were really based upon cavalry, and the cavalry were significant.
And the fact, again, that they're being bred.
Yes.
You know, I mean, that kind of breeding you think of also with women as the progenitors of a new generation of something. And these are men breeding horses as a new generation of a martial society.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have to think about that one. I think that there's much there. Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor. Really fascinating conversation about Songhai and Asika the Great, Muhammad. The question for me has always been that when we look at Islam in West Africa, particularly this period,
Yes.
it's always very hard to know which of these tradition and performances sort of come from their indigenous culture and tradition, and which is Islam. But at the same time, as we were talking about Songhai and the issue of concubinage and so on, my mind went to King Solomon and the Old Testament text. And there's so much similarity between that worldview and the period and the worldview that you sort of summarized.
Yes.
Which, of course, will explain to us as students of religion why the missionaries didn't want Africans to dwell so much on the Old Testament. They preferred the New Testament. So for scholars, and I can see the references to the Madinke, the Malian tradition, and so how do you deal with that? Particularly when there's so much similarities and you start wondering which is tradition, which is Islam?
Very good question. And so my response would be, generally speaking, it was the case that with the progression of Islam in these societies, you have, kind of intensification of kind of masculinist kinds of principles. Even in the case of Aminatu of Zaria, she's a ruler, but that society is becoming more and more patriarchal in a sense. So, it's a kind of analogous to the Queen of England. The fact that the principal monarch is a woman does not necessarily reflect, the fact that this society is not patriarchal. And so, I think that you do have this. Even in the, with respect to the ways in which elites are formed, the formation of elites in these societies is heavily male-centered. The girls will go to Quranic school up to a point in time, at which point their education ends. The boys will continue on if they have sufficient status and funds and so forth and so on. All of the sheikhs, all of the leaders are men. And you have to kind of do this forensic thing to try to figure out, well, where are the women? And it's difficult to find, to discover this. So it seems that Islam does play a role in this progression. Now, you're talking about, so we're looking at a period in time in which there is this conversation going on between, kinds of indigenous, autochthonous kinds of traditions and the development of Islam. And this leads to Professor Higginbotham and I were talking about this at the end of the last session. This leads to a very, very interesting, controversial area with respect to the nature of Islam in West Africa. So I'm not sure that we want to talk about that, but in some ways it's difficult to determine, it's difficult to find, it's difficult to kind of tease out where these traditions, from whence are these traditions coming. But I think as you look at the whole of the experience of Islam with not just African societies, but any society, you see this progressive masculinization of the society. And so it seems that there's some relationship there. What's happening in the Gambia is really interesting. And in that, you have a series of rulers who are clearly women. These are not, this is not fantasy. These are women rulers throughout the Gambia in all of these different towns. So I'm not quite sure if that represents a kind of, resistance to political masculinization. I'm not so sure if in the Gambia we have a kind of anterior representation of what was anterior in Senegambia among related communities. I'm not quite sure of that, but that was the case. So then we kind of branch out and we look at these other societies and so forth. And as you know, a society could be patrilineal, matrilineal, does not necessarily reflect who's in power, at least formally. So
I think it's Suzanne. Thank you
Yes,
much. I think I've got the mic. So a quick comment on the horse and then a couple of questions. What's interesting to me in part around this is that there was roughly a quid pro quo cost-wise with horse and slave in the trans-Saharan trade. So if you think about the use of horses to expand influence and to take people captive, then that sort of plays out. And you also have it in northern Nigeria in the Hausa in spades. So the savannah itself as an environmental zone where A, horses will survive, and B, you've got lots of area that you can extend to readily. On the concubine and eunuch question, I'm called to mind to Dahomey, which is later, of course, but there are interesting things here just to think through. One is to become a king of Dahomey, your mother could not be of royal blood. So one tends not to use the word concubine, one tends to use the word prisoner of war, which these women were. And then there was lots of fighting about who would then be the mother of the son who would rise to power. And for the most part, the children were removed at a certain age into a separate site, a separate place, so that they would not be competitive. But there were relatively few eunuchs in the court. It was all pretty much run by women. Of course, this is the place of the famous Amazons. They were in the military, they were in charge of munitions, they were in charge of the treasury. And so it may be unique to Dahomey, which was a place of lack, for lack of a better word. I mean, real political and financial needs caught between the Yoruba and the Asante in terms of presence and primacy of place. But I think that there are lots of models to think about the power of women in these contexts. And as you were talking, you kept going back to the kind of the matrilineage as a predeterminant and important factor. And I'm wondering how much that actually had changed, because I think that really says an awful lot in this. But anyway, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, so thank you so much for that, Suzanne. I think that what you're suggesting is a kind of, that is to say, this what develops in Songhai may represent a kind of, going back to the point that Jacob was raising before, that may represent a kind of indigenous kind of, tradition, which is interesting. We would need to learn a little more about Mali, and we would need to learn more about the mothers of the rulers who come to power in Mali to see what's happening. Because with the Askias, the Askias, in my position is that the Askias are Mande. These are Mande rulers. These are not Songhai. They're not Songhai. And so that's what I see in the sources. And so it would be very important to try to figure out, okay, do we have a similar kind of pattern with their predecessors upon whom they're modeling the governance and modeling succession and so forth and so on. Now, in contrast, you also have, perhaps contrast, you also have in Morocco a very similar kind of process in which a number of the rulers who come to power in Morocco in the 17th century are the sons of concubines. And those concubines are so-called sub-Saharan African women. And I don't know that they achieved the kind of acclaim that they achieve in Songhai, which is very clear in the Tarikhs that these women are celebrated. I mean, they are stars. So there we have a situation where presumably Islam is, is more deeply entrenched in the society and the culture. So it would be interesting to kind of look at this more carefully to see if we can articulate or disarticulate what's happening in Morocco relative to Songhai, relative to Mali, relative to Dahomey. Yes. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Hi, Professor. Thank
Yes.
you for this great talk. I'm interested in just how strong the comparison is between the concubine situation with the Askias and also in a place like the Ottoman court, perhaps. And I'm wondering, what is happening here that is specifically Islamic? Like, you elucidated for us that the law allows this setup to happen, up to 4 wives, the children of concubines are legitimate, etc. I mean, can we read this as an effort on the part of these African rulers to set up court in an Islamic way? Like, can it be a self-conscious effort to sort of see yourself as part of that milieu? I'm just wondering. I mean, you alluded to all this, but I'm wondering if we could draw that out.
My view of this is that Eskil Muhammad is using this as a political tool. That's how I read it. That is to say that he is, so what's happening here is, and obviously I could be wrong, but what's happening here is something different. That is, as opposed to Mali, and certainly as opposed to Ghana, or with respect to Kanem Bornu or other kind of Sahelian states that tend to be based upon what we can call ethnicity or related communities and so forth, practicing similar cultures. Songhai is really a heterogeneous construct in which you have Mande, in my view, Mande rulers taking power from the Songhai and then attempting to rule the Songhai, as well as a Timbuktu that tends to be dominated by people who are descendants of the Sanhaja and so forth, right? And then you have a myriad other communities in Songhai. And it seems that, so Songhai is the name of the state. Songhai is also an ethnic group. It's also a language, Songhai, Songre, different iterations of it. So it seems to me that what Eskil Muhammad is after is he's trying to create something different. And he's trying to create a circumstance in which people can vault over their primary loyalty to a place or to a community and resituate and redirect that loyalty to this concept of a state called Songhai. And I think he's very successful. There is some fighting within the state in order to maintain the integrity of the state, but most of the fighting is on the outside of the state. It's with respect to, he's trying to expand the state and so forth. And when we get to the fall of Timbuktu, 1591, with the Songhai, with the Moroccans, it really comes to the core because the Tariq el-Fatash and Tariq el-Sudan are written as in kind of nostalgic. There's a real nostalgia. The Moroccans and their descendants, the Pashas, are in power in Timbuktu and in that part of the area. So they are there, and the Tariqs are being completed in that context. They are not aspiring to be Moroccans. They don't have any interest of being incorporated into the north. They're longing for the days of Songhai control. So it's a really interesting development in that you do have this transition to a loyalty to a state that really transcends the local. And Skilas Muhammad engineers that. And in my view, the concubines play an enormous role.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Michael Gomez.
Professor Gates, can I just say one thing? I've enjoyed my time here. Thank you so much for your invitation.
Thank you. It's not over. We're going to have dinner. I'm holding mine.
Okay, all right.
My powder, keep it by powder dry for dinner.
Okay, all
Anyway,
right.
give it up again.